Well, the title of this talk implies a much larger scope than I'm really going to talk about today. I'm not going to get too much into policy and the Fish and Wildlife Service and stuff, but I'm going to talk more specifically about an area that I'm much more familiar with, and that's Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Washington. And before I want to get into it, I want to kind of throw up this definition of climate resiliency, and it's kind of the way I've been looking at things recently in terms of, there's basically two levels. There's one where we can make changes or do things that kind of absorb stress and try to maintain function in place for habitats such as wetlands. And then the second is when things are going to change, and we know they are, what are we going to do? I mean, function's going to change in these areas, and how can we facilitate that and to do things to kind of help move these systems into a still a desirable configuration, even though it's going to be different from what it was before. With channel scablands, I'm going to give some background on this. I don't know if people are familiar with it too much, but the channel scablands is a really unique geological feature in eastern Washington. It encompasses about 1.5 million acres. It was a result of a lot of processes, but the big one was the Ice Age floods that took place about 15,000 years ago. They originated in Lake Missoula in northwestern Montana. These the lobes of the continental ice sheet created these large dams and these wetlands behind it, and as the ice dams started to retreat, they broke away, and of course this happened numerous times, reforming the lakes and breaking again, and it created these vast floods that came across eastern Washington. And what happened was they came into the Spokane Valley area and the Columbia River, and they built up and then spilled over the top of the Columbia Plateau in these flood tracks. And this is a satellite image showing the flood tracks, and where I'm at is Turnbull, and that's right over here on the very eastern edge of what's called the Cheney-Palouse flood tract. And what the floods did was basically scour off the lush soils that had developed over millions of years on top of the basalts of the Columbia Plateau, and it eroded channels and potholes and stuff within these wetlands. Basically, at the post-flood situation, we had a fairly scoured landscape of flood outwash material and exposed basalt. But the wetlands or the depressions really didn't form wetlands at that point. They were fairly porous wetland. Water came into them, flowed out, because there was really nothing to hold the water in that fractured basalt landscape. It wasn't until about 8,000 years ago, with a series of cascade volcanic eruptions in Mount Mazama, Crater Lake being the most pivotal one, deposited ash over this area. And that ash collected in these depressions and formed this really distinctive layer in the bottom of all the wetlands in the channel scablands called tephra. And that tephra effectively sealed the basins, allowed water to stand in there and be purged, and then start the ecological successional process of wetlands. And this kind of shows you what the result is. This is the Cheney-Palouse flood tract here, and this is the lake region of northern Lincoln County with another major flood tract. And you can see that the density of wetlands is very high. Within these two flood tracts, there's over 22,000 wetland basins, representing about 76,000 acres of wetlands. And that's based off of NWI data, and I'm sure if we ran Megan's stuff on it, we'd find there's a heck of a lot more than that out there. And this is kind of just shows a little bit about the land ownership in that. You can see that several agencies have focused some of their acquisition and land consolidation within these flood tracts to protect wetlands. The brown is Bureau of Land Management lands. Here's Turnbull right here. And then the green is Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is the Swanson Lakes areas that Megan and Se-Young had talked about, some of their work that they had done. So basically, within that landscape, we have four basic kind of wetlands. We have these very deep lakes and sloughs that are permanent in nature. They hold water year-round in most years, except in very extreme droughts. And then we have, and these are fairly large. They can be anywhere from 100 to 400 acres in size. They tend to be long, linear systems that kind of orient with the flow of the floods. And then we have a number of these smaller pothole wetlands, and these can be up to 20 acres in size, but clear down to 1/10 of an acre. And they vary in hydrologic status from very ephemeral. Some of them are deep enough to be permanent. And then on that higher elevated portions of the scablands and towards the edge of the flood tracts, we end up with these Mima Mound prairies with swale areas and these very ephemeral vernal pools that occur. And you know about the vernal pools in California, they talk about quite a bit. Well, floristically, and the macroinvertebrate populations are very similar in these. So a lot of the same similar genera that you see in those California Valley vernal wetland systems. And then by far the most common wetland type within scablands is what I call the altered wetlands. And these are wetland basins that have been drained for agricultural purposes. And these are over 70% of the landscape or the wetlands are in this category. And this is a map that was done of the Turnbull area. Here's Turnbull in the middle here. And the green represent wetlands that have been altered through drainage ditches. And this happened about 1910 to 1920. It's one of the last areas homesteaded. If you've ever been out on the scablands, there's no soil in the uplands to farm. And so they were looking for tillable land. And what they had a great idea, we'll drain all the wetlands off and farm the wetlands. Well, that didn't work out too well. But they were very successful at it, you know, through a monumental effort, really, of using black powder and hand removal of rock. They blasted ditches through the basalt and connected all these basins up into a drainage system to take it out. And you can see the Turnbull's all in blue. Those are all undrained wetlands because they were all restored after refuge establishment in 1937. What that drainage did was it created a sort of an artificial watershed. Most of the wetlands in the scablands were not connected. They don't flow into any kind of regional drainage system historically. But now we have several watersheds, for Turnbull anyway, that are still drained, that flow now through the refuge wetlands and then off farther south into the Snake River and Columbia River system. So what happened was when Turnbull was established and we started plugging the ditches to restore the wetlands, we just didn't plug the ditches. We actually put water control structures in these because we recognized that with that artificial watershed, we now had supplemental water coming through several of the wetlands on the refuge, about 22 of them. And so we have these water control structures that allow us some limited wetland management. And these are the wetlands that we have on the refuge that are represented that we can manage. And so this one here is the company ditch in the Cow Creek system. Water flows into this wetland and then down through here and then out this way. And there's actually a little bit of side thing we can do over here. We can move water this direction too. And then we have another system over here actually that comes down, flows through these wetlands down to here, and then another one that feeds into this system too. So we're getting a fairly substantial amount of water now flowing through the refuge from off-refuge sites, and so we can manage those wetlands. We developed wetland goals through our habitat management planning process, and these are our two broad goals. Was one, to provide habitat conditions for wetland-dependent wildlife within a variety of wetland complexes and really focusing on migratory birds, because that was one of the reasons why we were established. And then second is to protect our water quantity and quality to maintain that habitat that's necessary for our native wetland flora and fauna. And so these are just a picture of some of the wetland-dependent species. What the goals were done, we broke them down into objectives, which are very specific towards the type of wetland habitats we want, like the amount of emergent vegetation, the depth of water, the timing of when that water is there and what depths. And we did that by developing what we call the guild approach. We assembled these species into guilds that functionally use wetlands in the same way, and we came up with models that sort of if we had the best case scenario, what kind of habitat would you need for them to be successful? And then we translated that into habitat objectives. So our current management is we're working to optimize the water level management in those 22 wetlands to achieve those habitat objectives, working to reduce non-climate stressors, and I'll show a list of those that we're working on in the future. We're also working to acquire and restore additional wetlands within those watersheds that feed onto the refuge, and actually out beyond that too. And then working with private landowners to encourage voluntary land water stewardship in the area that feeds into the refuge, and actually within this channel scablands itself. And this is really important because Turnbull's only 17,000 acres in size. We're not talking like national park size land. This is a relatively small unit of the landscape. And so we've really been trying to work out beyond our boundaries to try to achieve some further work in wetland protection and restoration. So these are some of the non-climate stressors that we're working with. Because those wetlands that drain off private land onto the refuge are most typically they're used for winter feeding operations for livestock, so we do tend to get a lot of nutrient flow into our wetlands. So we do have algal blooms and some issues with eutrophication. We have some invasive exotic plant species. We also deal with reed canary grass through most of our wetland systems. And we have some exotic fish species too on the refuge that we're working to control and manage. One of the things that we have is a forested landscape of ponderosa pine, and through fire suppression over the years, that forest cover has expanded significantly over what it should be naturally. And our belief is that, particularly around some of these wetlands where the pine overstory has gotten very dense, it's actually reduced snowpack through interception and reduced the yield of those small watersheds. And so it's having an impact on the hydrology of those wetlands. And so we're working very extensively on managing our forests too. And then, of course, there's a large number of wetlands in the landscape that are still either totally or partially drained. And we're also concerned about impacts to diversion of surface water that flows into the refuge and also groundwater mining potentially, because the area around the refuge is growing fairly substantially. We're pretty close to City Cheney. It's only 3 miles to the north of us, and Spokane's only 20 miles further on to the northeast. And so there's been a lot of pressure to divide land and build houses out there. So what are our expected climate impacts? This is kind of just from 1994 to the future. This is an index that we use. We basically look at the percentage of wetlands that are about greater than 75% full in May. We do a waterfowl pair survey every year. We go out and visit about 100 wetlands, and we sort of put them in a category as far as their depth and how full they are. But we can see that, in the early 90s, we had this really monster drought. Very few wetlands were full in May. In fact, a lot of wetlands were actually dry in May. And then we got into this wet cycle, and everything really kind of recovered, but then we dropped off into this other drought period, and wetlands really got fairly low again in 2004, and then we recovered again. But in recent years, we're seeing a really more variable conditions, but also some additional drought that's been taking place. And this year was a really dry year in the refuge. Most of our wetlands are going dry fairly quickly. So basically what happens is during these cycles is, this is a semi-permanent wetland on the refuge that we can look at kind of what happens with that. We have this shallow marsh stage, and this really occurs during the driest parts of those cycles, where the emergent vegetation begins to encroach on the open water areas, and we have very little open water, but the emergent zones get fairly thick, and reed canary grass also expands significantly during that period. In sort of the normal range of years, the wetland looks like this, where we have about a 50% open water, and then the emergence, and the reed canary grass is really pushed back to the very edge of the wetland in the transition zone. And then through the really wet cycles, we go into this lake stage, which is where the emergents are actually pushed back into that reed canary grass zone and only represent a very narrow strip around the rest of the wetland, and the most of the wetland is this open water area. So managing for expected climate change, when we think about this, we go back to looking at those 3 examples of those wetlands. And what we're going to see with increasing temperature and not real big changes in precipitation, but potentially less snowpack, we're going to see greater evapotranspiration, which is what they were showing on their graphs, is we're going to have, more rapid summer drawdown and drying in our wetlands. And snowfall is actually a fairly significant recharge for us, and particularly February snow. If we don't have February snow on the ground, with frozen ground conditions where we get like a fairly high water content and maybe a rain on snow event to get overland flow, our wetlands do not recharge very well. And so if we get less snowfall, it's going to have probably a significant impact on wetland recharge. So what are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of long-term adaptations is, because our wetlands are connected in this sort of stair-step fashion from, in some cases, 100-foot difference in elevation from the top of the watershed down to the bottom where it leaves the refuge, we had the potential maybe to prioritize how we fill wetlands and taking wetlands at the higher end of the watershed and using that water to maximize water depths and some of the ones lower on if we want to maintain some of that permanent wetland component. Very expensive, but we've also looked at the possibility of doing groundwater pumping. The aquifers in the refuge area are really interesting. There's two basic basalt groups, the Grand Ronde, which is fairly deep, and then the Wanapum, which are separated by a confining layer. And there's very little water transivity between the two aquifer groups. And the potential is to put in wells down into the Grand Ronde and to pump that water up to fill wetlands. That's has some problems and controversy because that's also the source of water for the city of Cheney. They pump out of the same aquifer, so we'd run into constraints there. But as the city of Cheney develops, they have a wastewater issue. And what they've done is they've created a tertiary treated wastewater system. And potentially, and they approached this to us years ago about diverting that water to wetland refuges and to refuge wetlands. And so that's something that we could revisit because this wastewater is not going to be going away. And then the last thing, and this kind of goes to that second part of the resilient definition, is that things are going to change. And we're not probably going to be able to prevent that. We can prioritize water, maybe pump water, but we're still going to, some wetlands are going to shift to a more xeric habitat type. And what can we do about that? You know, one of the thoughts that we had is potentially shifting those things to an aspen and deciduous shrub communities, which most of our wetlands are bordered by that, but as they draw down now, that habitat is now limited by how water might be able to be encroached down into those wetlands. And that's a very significant habitat for the refuge. It only makes up 2% of the landscape right now, but 55% of our bird species use aspen communities. And so increasing that habitat type would certainly benefit a whole host of species on the refuge. So one of the steps in initiating any of these adaptation strategies is evaluating how effective they might be under a course of climate change. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the use of models to do that. And the one in particular that we've been kind of playing around with, the idea of using, and we did some preliminary work back in the 90s with this, an earlier version of this model, and that's the WetSim model. It was developed out of Northern Prairie. I think you're familiar with it, but it's a spatially explicit model. It takes inputs on water from both precipitation, infiltration, and groundwater, and then also losses through evapotranspiration and overland flow, and it predicts spatially where certain vegetation communities are going to occur within that basin. And since most of our habitat objectives are based on those vegetation and where they occur in the wetlands, getting that kind of information will really help us to kind of predict how these adaptation strategies might work to maintain habitat objectives on the refuge into the long term. This is an example of two plates taken from a master's thesis done in 1995 by Aaron Mayer out of Washington State University, where he ran the WetSim model that was developed by Poyani and Johnson to look at climate change on a single basin in the Prairie Pothole region. And it had fairly decent predictive value. He ran it over a 20-year period. This is just 1 year comparing to 1994. And it was about 75% accurate in depicting, you know, the really gross scale of where emergent vegetation occur versus open water. The model itself breaks it down into, like, I think it's 10 different vegetation categories. But it shows that it has some real applicability to the channeled scablands area. So we've been working with Richard Volseth, who's one of the people that's been working like with Wetlandscape, which is one of the images that Seyoung showed, and other variations of the WetSim model. So what we're working on now is collecting more data. We have LiDAR for the refuge. We are developing bathymetric surveys of the wetlands that were full of water at the time of the LiDAR survey to get that underwater contour data. We're working on coding the data for working in model validation, and we're hoping to collaborate with Megan and their group to kind of interface some of their work with potentially WetSim to see if we can't get those two together and expand its use off the refuge to a larger geographic area. And that's it.
Thank you, Mike.